Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle, and this is my 65th video discussing British science fiction. In my last video, I described how John Lawrence and myself had placed our entire extensive program of Ron Turner comics with Harrier Comics in the belief that international distribution was to be undertaken by Titan distributors. Sadly, this ambitious publishing program was not to be fully realised. Nick Hazard #1 duly appeared in January 1988, featuring a longer adventure entitled Invaders from Time. We looked at this briefly in the last video. I'll show you some of the interiors. Featured some of Turner's best science fiction work for many years. The story was completed in the one issue. Was followed in February 1988 by E.C. Tubbs' 1955 story, Calgon the Golden. If anything, Turner was even better as he really got into his stride. The scenes in this boy are reminiscent of the first Star Wars film in the cantina, fighting with all sorts of aliens. Terrific interstellar adventure, lots of super science. You see there. That was that story. But whilst the Golden Amazon and the second Hazard story, Planet of Doom, were still in production, John and I discovered that the House of Harrier had been built on shifting financial sand. We were abruptly notified that Titan distributors, we see the house advertisement there, were cancelling their involvement with Harrier Comics, and Harrier Comics had been dissolved. The company was no more. We were not going to be paid a penny in royalties. Instead, we each received just a few score unsold copies of each issue. And that was that. I would never receive any apology or explanation from either party as to why this had happened. Today, looking back, John believes that our failure in the United States was due to unfortunate bad timing. He told me, with the success of Titan's 2000 AD albums in the US, featuring the work of top UK artists such as Dave Gibbons and Brian Bolland, a cult had sprung up amongst US buyers for all British independent SF publications. See a range of some of them there in the advertisements. And Titan had agreed to promote our titles there, together with those of Locke's other Harrier comics. there was a glut of British comics being exported to the US. But with US fans prepared to take anything British, everyone and his brother began to get in on the act and make a killing while it lasted. Subsequently, the market became flooded with inferior titles. And when the bubble burst and buyers came to their senses, US dealers were left with a glut of unsold stock. Sadly, Titan had dragged their heels, and we had come in at the tail end of this craze, with dealers now beginning to refuse any further work from the UK, regardless of quality. 6 months earlier, and it would have been a different story, and our credentials could have been established. As it was, with sales hardly breaking even, Titan broke with Harrier and pulled the plug, though I'm sure being lumped together with Locke's other titles, displaying inferior art, hadn't helped. The only positive that could be gleaned from this state of affairs was that our failure was no reflection on Ron's work. This was utterly devastating, as apart from being the death of our dream, on which we worked for more than 3 years, both John and I had expended many hundreds of pounds of our own money, as we'd been paying Ron Turner up front for his artwork. It must also have been immensely disappointing to Ron Turner that his work was not to be seen. Notwithstanding, both John and I agreed to fund Turner to complete The Golden Amazon and the second Nick Hazard adventure, Planet of Doom, which I'd freely adapted from Fern's Vargo Staten novel at time appointed, plus another contracted E.C. Tubbs story, Sword in the Snow, which had been intended to follow Calgan the Golden. Here we see Turner's unpublished comic, The Golden Amazon. Turner was again an absolute top form, producing his finest adult science fiction in years. Classic Turner action panels. This would have been published in 3 issues of the Harrier Comics. And you will see a second, what would have been the second Nick Hazard story, Planet of Doom. There's The Golden Amazon, which we've just looked at. Again, iconic Turner space action scenes. Brilliantly interpreting John Russell Fearn's story, splash panels. This would have been complete in 1 issue. And here we see the E.C. Tubb story that never was, Sword in the Snow. This was a sort of Conan type story. Classic sword and sorcery. But it was not to be. Despite the non-appearance of the comics at that time, Ron Turner did not end his association with either John or myself. Instead, it entered an entirely new phase. Turner had appointed John as his official agent, and he continued to find him commissions, whilst I began planning to redevelop my career as a science fiction book editor and literary agent. Now, from the early 1980s, I'd also privately commissioned Ron to paint covers for the remainder of Fern's science fiction novels that he'd not illustrated first time round in the 1950s. At the back of my mind, I never lost faith in the belief that I would eventually find publishers willing to reprint Fern's novels, and when that happened, I wanted them to feature a Ron Turner cover. My belief was well founded, and as I've shown in many previous videos, lots of wonderful Ron Turner covers have appeared posthumously and continue to appear, most notably on books published by Wildside Press. Many of these have been featured in my earlier videos. And here we see just a couple of examples of Liquid Death and Cataclysm. Now, in August 1989, I was tempted to purchase the new rebooted Eagle comic when they'd returned Dan Day to his original incarnation, drawn by one of his finest earlier artists, Keith Watson. See that here, reproduced in this Dan Day does, yeah? There's the new rebooted Eagle announcing the return of the original Dan Day, drawn by Keith Watson. It's a passable imitation of the great Frank Hampson. So once again I started collecting the Eagle comic, because this was back to the standard of the original Dan Day. And then the Eagle comic began a strip called The Amster Computer, which featured one-off very short science fiction stories, and I was moved to write for it a story based on Fern's World That Dissolved from the February 1939 Amazing Stories. See that magazine here, Amazing Stories, February 1939. And there is Fern's story, The World That Dissolved, which I decided would make a good strip for the new Eagle. So I quickly based a comic on it, and I drew it myself in pencil, roughly drawn in pencil, and submitted it to Eagle editor David Hunt, offering to have it redrawn by Ron Turner if they accepted it. Alas, Hunt rejected it as unsuitable for his young readers. However, I decided to privately commission Turner to redraw my strip anyway, and John Lawrence was happy to accept the commission for his client. I was so delighted with the result that I adapted two more favourite Fern short stories, Thoughts That Kill, from Science Fiction, October 1939. See that American magazine here. This Fern story, Thoughts That Kill, illustrated by Schneemann, famous artist. also did 2 other short stories, The Ghost Son by Fern, as well as No Greater Love by my favourite Vision contributor, Sidney J. Bounds. Both stories were from Vision of Tomorrow, May and July 1970. You see them here. And the issue featured The Ghost Son, which was a posthumous collaboration with Sidney J. Bounds. And the other strip I commissioned was based on Sidney J. Bounds' story, No Greater Love. That's a Jim Cawthorne illustration. Turner did his usual slick professional rendering and offered the Fern stories to the fanzine, the Comics Journal, where they were popular. Let's see the Comics Journal. And just have a look at the Fern stories first. I did an introductory article about Fern's pulp stories. And there's The Ghost Son. It was illustrated by Turner. That. And that was followed by Thoughts That Kill, which you see here. And the original story that had been intended for the Eagle World That Dissolved. It's just a 3-page short story. Editor Brian Whitworth, the editor of the magazine, whom I'd met whilst on holiday in Blackpool, subsequently offered to publish The Golden Amazon in an A5 format chapbook edition, signed by Ron Turner and myself, making something of a collector's item. You see that here. The Brian Whitworth edition of the Golden Amazon. This is the first ever publication of the Golden Amazon, and all the copies were signed by Ron Turner and myself. We saw that in the folder earlier on. And the Sid Bounds story was published in the Pulp and Comic, paperback Pulp and Comic Collector number 4. And there's the story which we saw earlier. Turner also returned to painting his favourite colour strip, the Daleks, from a new script especially written for him by John Lawrence, with the work published by Marvel Comics in the Doctor Who magazine. See that there? Famous Doctor Who magazine. And there's John Lawrence discussing Turner's work that had appeared in Doctor Who, to reference some of his earlier classic Vargo Statten work. You just see a picture of Ron Turner there. Unfortunately, Ron died before he could complete the story, but there was quite a bit of it published. And I believe a later artist has completed the work for John, and that appeared in another Doctor Who magazine. But his earlier Daleks work in TV 21 has since continued to be widely celebrated and reprinted. You see here, this was published last year, classic Daleks compilation. There we see John Lawrence's celebration of Turner's rendering of the Daleks, absolute classic stories. And the whole of the Dalek saga was reprinted in this book. And there we see the distinctive, iconic artwork of Ron Turner, drawn and coloured by himself at the time, brilliantly painted. This has been reprinted several times and is Turner's most famous comic strip creation. Absolutely stunning. Never been surpassed. As I said before, John actually continued this. This story finished, but John continued it for Doctor Who magazine. Thanks to his new agent John Lawrence, with whom I was privileged to work, Ron Turner's last years were happy ones, when he was again producing work which he really enjoyed. Ron died in 1998, but his artwork has continued to appear into the 21st century. And thanks to new computer technology, John and I were finally able to have our 1980s work, unpublished at the time, now published in a more befitting and full-size format on slick paper and in full colour in Spaceship Away magazine. Just bear with me a minute whilst I make room for reprinting. Spaceship Away magazine. Two, three, 6. Right, now what have we got here? We see them here. Now in Spaceship Away number 27, there was the first professional reprinting of Thoughts That Kill, colorized by Martin Baines, who did a super job. It's followed in 28, you see here. That was The World That Dissolved, which we saw, again coloured by Martin Baines. Finally did it justice. Number 29, the Sid Bound story, No Greater Love. Good story. Number 30, you see The Ghost Son in Martin Bain's glorious colour. This was split into 2 parts. It was completed in number 31. There was the end of that story. Now, in addition to that, our first Nick Hazard story, Mission to Vorga, was published in 5 episodes in number 16 through number 20. And this was colorized by John Ridgway. See that story here. Superbly colored this time by John Ridgway. That continued for 6 episodes. And now we'll see there. The Nick Hazard story, Planet of Doom, was done in 6 episodes, in number 35 through number 40. You just see the first episode, which I think we briefly have a look at in an earlier video. And then the next story, which we see here, 42. This was published in 9 episodes, and it was The Golden Amazon. You'll see an introductory article for the readers of Spaceship Away, photograph of Fern. And there's Martin Bain's colorization of Turner's classic rendering of The Golden Amazon. Then, in number 54, you see there, with the Ron Turner cover, which would have been the cover on which was the cover on the Harrier comic. It's Invaders from Town. Sorry, not Invaders. Yes, Invaders from Town. And that's currently being serialized, and it's 6 episodes to date, number 54 through 59. So we'll take a quick look at. There it is, brilliantly colorized by Martin Bain. Now, for his part, John Lawrence has also managed to keep Turner's work in print for the last 10 years, and he's published himself no less than 13 collections, mostly his classic 1950s Space Ace strips. I've already shown some of those classic collector's items and how to obtain them in my video number 47. And now we'll see a few more of them here. Here's just a couple of the Space Aces. These are all colorized by John Ridgway. Absolutely iconic artwork, brilliantly coloured, and some feature articles by John as well. That column. You see another classic Space Ace. Articles. All Turner collectors should have this magazine. Column. And then finally, we see John recently did an anthology of some of Turner's later work in the 1990s, which was done for other people other than myself did private commissions for Turner. And here's some of his later artwork. This story was commissioned by Andy Darlington, who was seeing his letters to some of my videos. And Andy was a great Turner fan, and he did a private commission of a Jet Ace Logan story, which he wrote for Turner. And there's a war strip, which John commissioned them to do. And then John wrote this story, Blonde Bombshell. It was submitted to Heavy Metal magazine in America, where it should have appeared, but unfortunately the editor turned it down. Why, I don't know. Because as you can see, it's a brilliant story. And the most recent John Turner reprint is some of his classic Western stories. These date from the 1950s, when Turner was working for the Lone Star comic, where Space Ace originally appeared. These are from the Lone Star annuals. But they've been colour, that was the original colour in the magazine, but these have been properly coloured by John Ridgway. So there we have it. Now finally, some exciting news. A publisher has contacted John Lawrence confirming their interest in the Ron Turner biography he is currently writing. John tells me that whilst his book will be text-driven, there will be plenty of accompanying black book and comic illustrations for each chapter, and lots of fair use reference illustrations, pre-1984, and then selections of his later work with myself and John. It will be a regular book rather than a coffee table art book. But both John and I are confident that after the biography is published, there's a good chance a second volume of our comic strips may be commissioned. But if any publisher is interested right now, please contact me.